Gearing up for the G20, leaders of the world's richest countries head to South Korea for a summit, and things may already be off to a bumpy start. Beijing is demanding an explanation about the U.S. Federal Reserve's decision to pump $600 billion more into its sluggish domestic economy, a move known as quantitative easing, something we've been talking about for a while now. The U.S. and China are also at odds over trade imbalances. Beijing has already rejected suggestions from the U.S. Treasury Secretary that hard targets be set to close these gaps. It is all unfolding as protesters make their voices heard. Anti-G20 activists clashed with police in Seoul on Sunday. So with this as a backdrop, what can be accomplished at the G20 talks? For that, we bring in Kirby Daly, who's a senior strategist at New Edge Group. So Kirby, with all of these tensions already starting to simmer, what do you think will really come out of the G20 on Thursday and Friday?
You know, it actually is setting up to be more interesting than most G20s. I am highly skeptical at all of these global summits that anything workable will come out, because the idea is really to placate fears around the world of worse things to come, and they set targets that are very loose, they're very sort of fluffy, I like to call it, and nothing is ever really implemented that makes a difference. This time the U.S. has achieved something great, and that is basically turning the whole world against it. With the implementation of QE2. QE2 has sort of become the U.S.'s de facto foreign policy at this point, because it's affecting essentially every country, every economy in the world. At least that's what they think.
And there's a lot of criticism already with
Exactly.
the Fed's move last week with QE2 and the $600 billion. And there are interesting arguments going around. Some critics are saying the U.S. is doing exactly what the U.S. is accusing China of doing, which is devaluing its own currency. But then there are other people who say, listen, this gives banks more capital reserves. It makes banks a little bit more comfortable to lend to Americans to hopefully get the economy going. So you've got a lot of differing arguments there. What do you think is the right one?
Well, if you look at history, if you look at the data, if you look at when this has been tried before, it's really the first one, the former, that is more correct if you're going on past data. QE, quantitative easing, has never been successful at creating demand for loans. And this is the problem. It's not the cost of credit. It's the demand for credit. And quantitative easing and lowering interest rates does not affect that at all. So when we're at the G20, this argument will probably be played out, and that's why I was saying it'll be more interesting than ever, because there actually probably will be sparks flying. There will be arguments. There will be debate about this very topic that you're talking about. And the thing is that anyone who's saying that quantitative easing is going to be effective in getting loans moving and getting the economy moving and affect GDP doesn't have any historical precedents to base that on. So it's not going to be a good argument to be on the side of.
Meanwhile, emerging markets in Asia are quite worried about this new round of QE2. They're fearful that with all this cheap currency floating around, cheap dollars going around, it's going to flood their own markets.
Yes.
And because investors are looking for yield, so they're going to go into emerging markets. It'll drive up these emerging markets currencies, which hurts their exports. So there's this whole domino effect. With this in mind, do you expect that there are going to be more capital controls coming from emerging markets, similar to what Brazil did, which is taxing foreign capital coming in?
Yes, I do expect that, and I expect it probably more quickly than many do expect, because, again, if they raise interest rates to try to keep a cap on inflation, that's going to cause more hot money flows. We've seen this before. Again, quantitative easing, when it was tried in Japan, flooded the world with liquidity that caused the carry trade. This all goes back very simply to the carry trade. And so central banks around the world unilaterally are very impotent at being able to affect their own policies, because we were affected by Japan's quantitative easing and the flooding of the world with that liquidity, but it wasn't quite as abrasive as it is now with the world's reserve currency being the main center of the carry trade, which means money will be borrowed in dollars and it will find the destination where it can get the highest return. Right now, that is emerging markets, and that is a major problem for these economies.
But if we see more of these capital controls, isn't that going against exactly what the finance ministers of the G20 said recently, that we're going to cooperate, we're not going to practice trade protectionism? So it's going exactly against what they said they wouldn't do.
That's right. This is sort of like a multifaceted prisoner's dilemma. We have to rebalance the global economy, which means individual actions by each country are going to be detrimental in the near term to each economy. So which means who's going to be first? And then with the U.S. firing this first missile or nuclear bomb, if you will, there's very little incentive for anyone to jump on. So the fact that they come out at all of these summits and they say, this is what we're going to do, and then they don't implement it, that's why I'm very skeptical of anything being really accomplished there. But I don't think they can actually come out of this G20 and just say to the world, hey, we're going to cooperate again like they did last time, because no one's falling for it anymore, and it's not productive. They need to actually battle it out and really decide how we're going to go forward, because if we're going to go unilaterally with capital controls being implemented, it's going to be a very, very negative, it's going to have a very negative impact on the global economy that's teetering on the edge of moving back into a real difficult situation.
And as you say, the U.S. on the defensive this time around.
Oh, yeah, and they should be.